Hi, I'm Ash and welcome to this review of the AFS Blackbird. The board we have in review here is the 6'2" by 21" by 90 litres variant of the Blackbird. There is also a 6'4" by 100 litre variant, but we are riding the smaller of the two. The construction is from triaxial carbon in a full carbon sandwich with high density foam for stiffness. The board features a concave deck to reduce the distance between the rider and the foil and to allow for more control. There is a runoff from the concave deck to the rear of the board to allow water to leave the concave deck easily. The board design has a lot of volume forward in the nose of the board, which should make it very stable under the front foot during takeoff and also ensure touchdowns are drama free. The rails are soft towards the front of the board and hardened towards the rear into a pin tail. The pin tail obviously being focused towards reducing the hydrodynamic drag on the board. The board also features winglets towards the rear of the board, which are designed to provide a little extra stability when the board is not moving, but these are released from the water as you gain speed and allow the pin tail to take over. The board features a US track box, inserts for foot straps and comes in at a weight of 5.5 kilograms, which is pretty light for a board of this size. Of course, with a carbon sandwich construction and lightweight, you also sacrifice a little durability, so it isn't going to be quite as resilient to being fallen on or mistreated. Such is the compromise when you sacrifice weight for performance. AFS recommend the rider choose the 6'2" board if you are under 75 kilograms and the 6'4" board if you are over 75 kilograms. This is based upon the dual usage of the board for either sup foil or light wind winging, with a bit more volume recommended if you intend to stand on it with a paddle for sup foiling. As I'm only looking at this board from a light wind winging perspective, I don't need the extra volume for standing on it with a paddle, and as such I'm riding the 6'2" board at 90 litres just for light wind winging. Usually for a board review I will do close-up footage of the board, but for this video I chose not to, mainly because the board I'm using has been in demo for quite some time and it was carrying a few battle scars. Instead I'm just going to use a few static promo shots to highlight the board design elements. Here you can see the concave deck with a deeper concave into the front of the board. This is because there is a lot of volume loaded into the nose of this board, so the concave is more obvious towards the nose. The concave deck is designed to get you closer to the foil and provide more control. You can also see here the runoff channel to the rear of the board to drain water out of the concave deck. On the bottom you can see here the pin tail and also the wings at the rear that are designed to provide extra stability for sup foiling. More on these later when we look at light wind takeoff onto foil. The bottom shape is free from concaves and just has a simple rounded nose and rocker flattening off into the pin tail and wings at the rear. Lastly, you can see here the mast track. It's fairly short, it's not a particularly long mast track, and it's also positioned towards the centre of the board, so you can see from my riding position in the video footage I'm quite a long way with my back foot from the back of the board. Given I'm looking at this board as a light wind wing board, let's now take a look at light wind getting onto foil. This next clip is a very light wind start and we're going to take a look at the characteristics of the board as we pump it onto foil. You will note that as I'm kneeling on the board that despite it being a 90 litre board and me being a weight of 82 kilograms, I'm sinking the tail quite significantly. This is due to much of the volume being loaded into the nose of the board. This is having two effects: it's keeping the nose high, but it's also as a result causing the tail to sink. As soon as I get a few knots of forward motion, the board comes to the surface and starts to rise due to the water pressure on the bottom of the board and some lift from the foil. Note the wake of the board as I pump it onto foil. What I want you to see here is that the tail of the board is staying in contact with the water until the very last moment that the foil lifts it clear, and that the wake shows that the full width of the board is engaged with the water, and only in the very last fractions of a second do we plane off of the pin tail. This next clip I get a slightly stronger gust, and you'll see the same characteristic again where the drag is across the full width of the board, and you can see some wake coming from those wings on the back of the board until we finally leave the water. What I want to point out here is that although the flared wings at the back of this board are there primarily for roll stability, and they do also serve another purpose that I'll come on to shortly, they are adding a compromise to the board in terms of drag. This drag factor is there right until the last moments of takeoff. How much this is affecting the light wind acceleration and takeoff is hard to say, as you would have to ride exactly the same board without the wings to make a judgment. With regard to the other purpose these serve, if you are subfoiling, then these winglets add some surface area to be lifted and pushed by a wave from behind. So whilst they may be compromising drag in a wingfoil takeoff, they will be providing some extra push in a subfoil wave takeoff. So whether these add anything to your overall experience will really depend on whether you are a dual use person and using this board for both wingfoiling and subfoiling. Alternatively, if you are a beginner/intermediate, you might just appreciate the little bit of extra roll stability they're designed to provide. Personally for me, I'm wingfoil only, so I prefer just the pintail to the rear for a faster, narrower board on takeoff. Let's move on from light wind takeoff and look at the performance of the board in general foiling. The first thing of note riding these boards is that you do tend to stand quite a long way forwards, with the front foot touching into the round concave at the front. This took a little time to get used to, as it was an unfamiliar foot position for me. I did try moving the foil backwards, but found this compromised the takeoff and made the board a little more sticky to get off the water, so I went back to a mid-track position for the mast. Without straps, it takes a little bit of time to work out where your feet are meant to be for comfortable foiling, especially as with this board you feel like you're stood quite a long way forwards with a lot of board behind you. Once I got used to this and worked out my stance and foot position, the board rode really quite nicely. Things of note were that the board has excellent touchdown recovery due to an abundance of volume in the nose, probably one of the best touchdown recoveries I've experienced. Once you have your feet in the right place, it rides comfortably and without any drama. I do ride in straps usually, and this board came without straps, so there was some level of discomfort for me riding strapless, but nevertheless it was quite easy to push this board through Heineken jibes, race jibes and normal jibes. It didn't take long to adapt to its slightly different feel with the forward foot positioning, and after 30 minutes or so I was quite comfortable with the board. It does feel quite lightweight underfoot despite its size, and there was also not a lot of noticeable swing weight. The board was also relatively easy to pump, but obviously not as intuitive as a much shorter board. Here you do feel the length a bit more and notice the rise and fall of the nose much more than on a shorter board. I didn't get to jump the board as there were no straps, so I can't attest to how it handled jumping. I didn't feel like the board rail tracked that much, and this is mostly due to it being fairly short at 6'2" and being 21 inches wide, making it less likely to want to just go straight. It was also fairly easy to push off the wind as you accelerate onto foil. So from the perspective of a longer board for light wind foiling, there are fewer of those long thin board tendencies that you get, such as rail tracking. The other side of the coin here is that it also didn't then track so strongly off the foil for riding back to the beach when the wind died and you then had to sail back without the use of the foil. So let's try to summarise this and position this board as to who it might appeal towards. First, let's take the perspective of a beginner looking at this as a light wind wingboard. Here I think the bit of extra width at 21 inches and the winglets to the rear make this an attractive option. Whilst it is quite a bit more tippy and roll than a normal wide beginner's wingboard, you would within a few sessions get used to it. Additionally, there is no doubt that it also gets off the water a lot sooner and more easily than a traditional wide beginner board. I would add the caveat if you are learning in choppy waters that it may hamper progress due to the more tippy roll axis. However, as soon as you master the balance of the board, then everything else from here is positive compared to a traditional long and wide beginner board. It will generate speed far more easily, require less wing pumping technique and has longevity. There's no need to sell it once you've learned, and it could quite easily become your daily driver. If we now look at it from an intermediate wing foiler perspective, also looking for a light wind wingboard, unless you are very sensitive to the roll axis, then this for me is a little bit wide at 21 inches. I feel that 20 inches wide is perfectly manageable for most intermediates, and this would make the board faster onto foil. I also feel that an intermediate would not need the additional stability of the wings on the rear, and just a pintail would be a better option for acceleration onto foil. I would say though that if you're not confident and are worried about the width of the board and a tippy roll axis, then this would probably offer a very good option for that intermediate foiler. Intermediates could also run this just as a one board quiver and use it as a daily driver for all conditions. For an expert wing foiler looking for a light wind board, well, for me this is just too wide, and a 19-inch or less board would be much more performant in lighter winds. I don't expect an expert wing foiler to have any issues with tippy roll axis, so I'm not convinced this is a good match for an expert looking for light wind performance. Now this is where we can throw a little bit of a curveball, as you may want to subfoil or possibly downwind your light wind board. For downwinding, I think this board is certainly a little short, and for someone of my weight is just not suitable with only 8 litres of positive volume over my rider weight. However, an expert downwinder in the 60 to 70 kilogram range could potentially use this board for downwinding and also for light wind winging, and here the wider tail may well help with stability. For subfoil and light wind winging, again we're probably looking at a rider in the 60 to 70 kilogram weight range, although I'm sure an expert subfoiler at 80 kilograms could probably still make this work. Here the winglets at the back will provide an extra area for the wave to push against in a takeoff and provide some advantage in terms of stability stood on the board with a paddle. So overall, looking at this design, I think it's perfectly fine for a beginner as a first light wind board, and could be used to learn on potentially in calmer or flatter waters. For an intermediate or expert, you may want some degree of dual usage to offset the compromise from the wider tail over a dedicated light wind wingboard that would normally just have a pintail, and also an intermediate or an expert could probably easily ride a much thinner board and get some more performance. It certainly still works as a light wind wingboard for the intermediate or expert, but there are designs and smaller widths that would certainly be a better match. Where this board makes the most sense is either you're looking to wing and subfoil and therefore want some dual use capability where the extra width will help when subfoiling. Alternatively, you're looking at it from a one board quiver perspective and want a lightweight board with a bit more light wind performance, but without necessarily going all out into the narrow and longer light wind wingboard designs. Effectively, you'd be maintaining some width for stability, but equally being less wide and a bit longer than traditional wingboards. I hope you enjoyed this review, and my thanks to AFS UK for loaning me the board to do the review.